Okay, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to an amazing, amazing Saturday session. I'm so excited. Today, we had talked before about how we were going to do a Q&A for Surah Mumtahina, but I didn't actually get many questions, and then we also wanted to keep moving forward. So Sheikh actually did pray istikhara on a surah and got Surah Tawbah, but because we all know this is a crazy semester, we have just an overwhelming amount of work, and preparation for Surah Tawbah is going to take more than just one evening. So we are going to put that forward to next week, inshallah. So next Saturday we'll cover Surah Al-Tawbah. But for today, we're going to go back to some of the short surahs that Sheikh has previously covered in line-by-line format. And these were ones that we actually did back in the 1990s in the halakas then. And so today, inshallah, we're going to have the Project Illumine spin, and we have about 27 of those, including Al-Fatiha, but the really short ones are ones that we can kind of just do in any order from what I understand from Sheikh. And so I'm really, really excited to go back and revisit some of those. I don't know if people have had a chance to listen to any of those. They are available on our SoundCloud channel in audio. A lot of times people write and they say, oh, why is the sound quality so bad? Well, because back in the 90s, we were doing it on audio cassette tape, and we had to convert them from audio cassette to digital. And so you, of course, lose a lot of sound quality in that. And so we tried to use, technology to improve the sound. But the content is absolute gold, but I feel like this is really a treat and such a blessing to be able to revisit those surahs because they're really powerful and really important. So, alhamdulillah. So that's the plan. And I, of course, have to begin by calling attention to yesterday's incredible khutbah. Once again, we titled it How to Kill the Soul of Islam, which is pretty interesting. I think if people see that title, be like, how do you kill the soul of Islam? But it's actually, a really important insight into the dynamic that happens with, people who are giving khutbahs. Sheikh talks about this verse that we often repeat but never really think about how, when you are guided by God, you cannot go astray, and anyone that God does not guide, you can't help them, basically. I mean, I paraphrased very poorly. But there are two ways in which you can understand that verse, and one of them being if you choose the guidance through God, then that is, that can save you. Anyway, I obviously cannot do it justice, so I really highly, highly encourage people to go back and listen to it. But what was really powerful about it, aside from, even just recognizing that there's nuance in how you understand certain verses, and they do change the meaning tremendously, because one is kind of like if you're just waiting for guidance from God, it's a very passive receipt of God's guidance, as opposed to if you actively choose, I'm choosing the path of God. I mean, it's a very different dynamic, and so it's a very meaningful distinction that deserves a lot of reflection. And the point that Sheikh was making is that a lot of times you hear in khutbahs people repeat these verses, but they don't really actually take the time to really reflect on what does that mean and how do we apply that to the way we live our lives, and what is the consequence of not doing that, not reflecting and not necessarily actively applying these principles to our lives. And one very stark and horrifying example Sheikh talked about is there's a UN report that just came out about the number of people who are trafficked across the world, the vast majority of them being Muslim. And there's this statistic that there are 20 refugee children, effectively Muslim children, who disappear off the face of the earth. They come into Europe, they're registered, so it's like they arrived, and then they just disappear, never to be seen again. And we know that they end up getting lost.
20 a day.
20 a day. What did I say? Oh, sorry. 20 a day. And they end up being trafficked. These are children who are sent, to Europe with the hopes of their family to find a better life, whether they're coming from Iran or Afghanistan or Syria or wherever they're coming from. They're going in hopes of a better life. Their parents don't realize they're sending them off to end up trafficked. And so it's a really, really devastating understanding of the reality of our world. This, when circling back, when you say, in khutbahs, these phrases about how God, whoever God guides, and not really think about what that means, and you're silent when it comes to these kinds of issues, people lose faith in what the true meaning of Islam is. And that's where you can kill the soul of Islam, because then people start thinking that, yeah, you can say these platitudes, but they don't actually have any real meaning on the ground. So there was so much to this khutbah. Once again, I really encourage people to watch it or read the summary of it in the weekly email, or, hopefully I think it's got its place in Prophet's Pulpit 3, Volume 3, which we are already populating. So alhamdulillah for that. Volume 2 is already in the pipeline, so lots of good things to look forward to. Lastly, I just wanted to share this very interesting article that came out on September 8th in the New Yorker. The title is "The Debate Over Muslim College Students Getting Secret Marriages," and it's starts out talking about how there's an imam at Claremont Colleges in Los Angeles. He's getting contacted by Muslim students who want to be secretly married and ask him to perform these ceremonies. They don't want to tell the parents, but they want to have premarital sex, but they also don't want to forget about their faith. So it's obviously a very complex and important question about how young people are navigating, relationships and sex and all of these things, and trying still to stay within their tradition. It's actually, I was expecting to read an article that was going to anger me or upset me. Actually, I thought it was actually a pretty good article, but it just raised issues, which I think are really important, especially here we talk about issues that deserve a lot of critical thinking and consideration about the challenges that are in our time, in our age. And a lot of times when I read these sorts of articles, they strike me as, man, I wish the people who were part of this or who were being interviewed knew what we're doing here in the halakas. And I'll read you this one sentence that actually really made me feel that way. Many of the feminist Muslim scholars I spoke with described feeling trapped between two intellectual traditions. Quote, "You are either for women's rights or you are for Islam, but you can't be both," describing a widespread mentality. And it goes on to, another scholar says that she had, quote unquote, deeply internalized the idea that she was an oppressed Muslim woman. Obviously, this is, we are uncovering incredible gold in these halakas about rights, women's empowerment. These are things that can be in our collective toolbox to try and come up with solutions to push Islam forward, to push humanistic thinking forward. And I really wish and I encourage people, if you are, if you know people, just again, to spread the word about what we are learning here, about the possibilities, right? And I liken this to, a lot of times when we think about Islam, we think about what we hear in the mosque. You hear the same hadith over and over again. You hear the same verses over again. You hear the same commentary on the same verses over and over again. And you start getting, this very clear picture that Muslims operate in a very small box. You only have a very limited toolkit in order to address the challenges of your world. And oftentimes when you don't have the right tools in that toolkit, you just throw the toolkit away. And what we're doing here is we are actually really broadening that toolkit. We have so many things to reflect upon in our Quran, in our book, things that have not been fully developed, fully reflected upon, fully, brought forward and applied to our time and age. And it's exciting. It's exciting from where we sit. And I think that, if you read this article, again, it's called "The Debate Over Muslim College Students Getting Secret Marriages." You can also add to your toolkit by some of the content that we've already produced that is, I think, extremely valuable. There's a couple of things that you can find on our YouTube channel. The Sheikh did a Q&A on young Muslims on dating and romance and marriage. It's like 2 different videos or 2 parts. And then, of course, we did earlier this year 2 incredible Q&As on the topic of sexual and spiritual abuse. And these are all things that actually we're also working on, hopefully publishing in a reading, in a book format. But that is still a bit out, because that, these things take a lot of time and a lot of effort. But I'm proud to say that, a lot of the work that we do here is trying to make that toolkit larger, more nuanced, more, agile for what we're confronting. And these things are out there right now. I hope that people will utilize them, because part of this whole education is liberation and empowerment, but it has to be based on our tradition. And one of the things that really struck me in this article is just that feeling like we already know what's in our tradition. It's very limited. There's not much there. And they're so wrong. And if only they knew what we're covering, it could change just the whole game, the whole conversation, and push everybody forward into really enlightened, beautiful thinking. So anyway, for what that's worth, with that, I am so excited to start again on another short surah, Surah Al-Alaq. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to an amazing session.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. سبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد الحبيب المصطفى المرسل رحمة للعالمين خاتم الأنبياء والرسل أجمعين وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين وعلى أصحابه المختارين وعلى من اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي يا رب العالمين. As Grace mentioned, the next surah really should be Surah At-Tawbah, but I am just currently swamped and extremely overtaxed. And Surah At-Tawbah, we have really Surah At-Tawbah and Al-Ma'idah and An-Nasr that are left that have never been covered at all. And At-Tawbah just needs effort and energy that I currently don't have. Inshallah, but in the meanwhile, we go back to the short surah, which I've actually covered in quite a bit of detail in the past. The coverage of these short surah will not focus, as I did in the past, on all the different schools of thought and all the different opinions about what this ayah means or what this word means or the various reports about whether this is intended to talk about a particular figure or not, but rather just focusing in this approach on, if you put it simply, on my understanding of these short surah. So it's far more succinct and far more to the point, and it if you're interested in all the variations, if you will, then go back to the earlier tafsir that I did, the line by line, because there's a lot that about various historical debates and various theological orientations and so on that I'm leaving out. And Surah Al-Alaq is a good example of that. Okay. So, Surah Al-Alaq, although most say that at least the first 5 ayat, the first 5 verses, were the first ever revelation of the Quran. So, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق the opening of this surah, the first five ayat, um, are the first of the Quran to be revealed, period. Even before Al-Fatiha. And that most authorities say that then the rest of the surah was revealed about a year later in Mecca. So the surah was not completed until about a year later. Although that is what is often asserted as the majority opinion, interestingly, you do find within the Islamic tradition those who argue that Surah Al-Alaq was not the first revelation, and that some say that Al-Fatiha was the first revelation. Some say that Surah Al-Qalam was the first revelation. Um, although it takes a long time trying to figure out the basis for a claim, or the basis for a counterclaim. While it is fairly easy to understand why the majority said that Surah Al-Alaq is the first revelation, as we'll see, and trying to understand why some said that it is not the first revelation, but rather Al-Fatiha or Al-Qalam, or these are the two main surahs that people have claimed came before Al-Alaq. Trying to figure out the basis for that claim. You read a report that, such and such of the very earliest authorities said Qalam first came first. But the historical basis for that claim. So to make a long story short, because this, something as simple as that takes a considerable amount of time to trace reports, to trace chains of transmission, to trace who said what and who communicated it, and whether there's a possibility that there's an error in transmission, whether there is a possibility that someone didn't hear of a particular report. The result of this long process is, no, I'm fairly comfortable in saying that the claims that there was a revelation before Surah Al-Alaq are erroneous. And I think that the reason there is a confusion that occurred because of the fact that the first five ayat were revealed first, and then the surah was completed later. In that the first five ayat were revealed, then we had Al-Fatiha, then we had Al-Qalam, and then Surah Al-Alaq was completed. And some, in transmitting the chronology of the Quran, I don't want to use a charged word, but some were not careful in saying, well, just because Surah Al-Alaq was completed a year later, it doesn't mean that it was not the first in Revelation. Okay, so why is it important that we understand whether it was first in Revelation or not? Well, because of the narrative about the beginning of the prophecy of Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. So in a very widely reported, um, now, mind you, I have first to warn you that when it comes to reports about the beginning of Revelation, you will find a considerable amount of fantastical um, mythology. So, for instance, a report that says that the prophet saw the angel Gabriel sitting on a chair in the sky, and that Gabriel was so huge on his seat on the when you spend the time filtering through these reports, you discover that it, the historical basis is extremely weak, and um, these were medieval narratives in which people were communicating important ideas, but communicating these ideas within the medieval epistemological framework, the way that the medieval mind e- expressed events, described events, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot, and this warning is important because if you have, although I personally do not advise Muslims to just simply pick up a book of hadith and read it, because I think hadith, because you're dealing with material that is historically contingent. The nature of books of hadith is that they are a product of a historical moment, and you need training to understand a discourse within a historical moment. But nevertheless, if someone does that, they will confront a lot of fantastical claims. Okay, the part though about Surah Al-Alaq that is very widely reported is the part that most Muslims are familiar with. That the Prophet ﷺ, because Mecca had a concept of Allah, but Mecca believed there are different competing beliefs in Mecca, but the ones that seem to be quite dominant in Quraysh is that God created. God is the creator. But rububiyyah, uluhiyyah is God, and uluhiyyah is uluhiyyat al-khalq, meaning that God created. But rububiyyah here means the divine intent active in the universe is not God's. That this is a sort of a disinterested God. God created, but once God created, God became disinterested, sort of went on to other things. What is active, if you will, in what they used to in Greek philosophy call the active intellect, the active intellect in the universe belonged to angels, demons, jinn, idols, things that are not God, things that are subservient to God, but they don't answer to God. So it is not that simply because in Qurayshi belief, God is not interested. God is saying, I created this universe, and I have, if you will, semi-gods, these powerful beings that run things, and because they're vested in the results while I'm not. And Muhammad والسلام, found this understanding extremely troubling. And all indications were, although this was a minority position, but even, for instance, Khadija's cousin, um, what was his name? Waraqah. Waraqah ibn Nawfal. Khadija's cousin Waraqah ibn Nawfal disagreed with this understanding. And all indications were that Muhammad والسلام, also found this idea extremely troubling, because what it amounted to is that this is a God who's not involved, so it is not a compassionate God, it's not a merciful God, it is not a just God, it is a disinterested and disengaged God. And it left, whether right or wrong, were determined by the semi-divine beings, whether jinn or angels or idols or whatnot. Um, they were the ones that produced results in the universe. And because they're the ones that produced the results in the universe, they also decided on what's right and wrong. And so Muhammad's habit before the beginning of Revelation, as the famous story, the story that most Muslims know, is that he would spend long periods of time in isolation, of course, whether in his home or in the cave of Hira, or even the practice that Mecca frowned down upon, is that he would go before the Kaaba and prostrate, which in his mind was the Kaaba of Ibrahim, that because he knows this from the Ahnaf and the mythology of Arabia at the time, that this is what Ibrahim and his son constructed, that he would spend a considerable time in sujood before the Kaaba, or he would go to Hira and be in a state of spiritual communion with this one God, and think through, or in one form of ibadah or another, seek after the understanding of this one God. And this is when this is when the famous event where the angel Gabriel appears to him and says the famous words, Iqra. And as the well-known narrative goes, is that when the Prophet ﷺ hears this voice, responds, well, I don't read, ما أنا بقارئ. And the angel Gabriel says again, Iqra, and again the Prophet says, ما أنا بقارئ. And then a third time, Iqra, ما أنا بقارئ, I read, I don't read. And then Muhammad receives the first revelation of Surah Al-Alaq. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم, and so on. Okay. There is I don't know if I should, okay, I'm going to tell people who say, oh, don't rush. In the Hadith tradition, the Hadith that we have is that the Prophet ﷺ says, Gabriel said, Iqra, Muhammad then responds, Ma ana biqara, read, I don't read. And then in so many versions, it says, فَأَخَذَنِي فَغَطَّنِي. And normally this is translated as, well, let's see if, like, for instance, what, does Muhammad Asad have it? Oh, he says, then he seized me and pressed me to himself. Yeah. That أخذني غطاني normally translated as then Gabriel pressed me or pressed me to himself and then released me and then said, read. And then I said, I don't read. Then he seized me and pressed me to himself and then he said, read. And he said, I don't read. This gave me pause because I've always wondered, and even since I was quite young, what is this about? Why would, if the angel Gabriel seizes the prophet and presses him, exerts some type of pressure on him, that makes the experience more traumatic. And what is the logic behind this making the experience more traumatic? But you find that same type of expression, أخذني فغطني, in the majority of the versions of narrating this incident. And eventually, I found that expression, غطى الشيء, or in Arabic poetry, and it is not used in the sense of something grabbed me and seized me and pressed me to himself or to her or to herself, but that it was used in the sense of I was overcome, that the confrontation with a being that is not of this world. In our modern terminology, which we'd say the energy exerted upon the body of Muhammad by the mechanics of the situation made him overcome. So it is not that the Prophet Gabriel was inflicting upon Muhammad pressure, but that very exact same expression, something took something, فغطته, refers to being overcome by the event or by the moment created by another. So, and it was used in the context of love poetry. It was used in the context of issues relating to honor and the honor of battle and honor of and so on and so forth. And then when I found that far more satisfying than it was. one can imagine that this would be an overwhelming moment, and it would not be at all surprising if the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, repeatedly felt overcome, or repeatedly even felt that he is about to faint. But the way that this is expressed in the tradition is فَأَخَذَنِي فَغَطَّنِي, or in some versions, the word أخذني is not there. فَغَطَّنِي directly. Okay. Now, so what is the significance of this being the beginning of the revelation, and especially what follows in the surah? We are often taught that the opening of the surah talks about read because and that God has taught you, etc. And then the second half of the surah addresses the persecution by Abu Jahl. This is often what is communicated about the surah. But let's just keep this in your mind, because we will revisit these issues in a second. Okay. So, read in the name of your Lord who has created. The beginning of Surah Alaq. Who has created human beings from but a clot. Read, and your Lord Al-Akram, and your Lord is greater, or your Lord is superior, who has taught you by the pen. Okay. The command to read could be taken as a command to communicate the Quran. So it is as if it could be taken to mean that read to people, communicate to people the Quran, and do so in the name of your Lord. The difficulty, though, if you limit it to the communication of the Quran, is Iqra would not be the most ideal word for the instruction to be to recite. And if the Prophet ﷺ responds, Ma ana biqari, I don't read, if the meaning was recite to people the Quran, it wouldn't make sense that the Prophet ﷺ would respond, well, I don't recite. If the command is recite to people the Quran, it would be rude, it would be defiant for the Prophet to respond by saying, no, I will not recite. So the fact that the Quran focuses on this particular word, read, in the name of your Lord, and does not specify, does not mention reading the Quran, and the context tells us that the Prophet ﷺ understood read as a command to do what he in fact is incapable of doing because he's illiterate. And he says, well, I don't know how to read. Gives us pause. Because then the meaning becomes quite interesting. Why read? And the conclusion is inescapable that the first command, the very first proof of the majesty and the miracle of God's creation and God's vestedness in what God created is precisely the command to seek knowledge, to learn. It is like saying, the life of the people that you know, the people that you grew up with, the Meccans, is one in which the relationship to higher power is always about winning and losing. God is disinterested, and whatever higher powers the Meccans deal with, it is always about a material gain or a material loss. But here what is invoked, what is being communicated to the Prophet, and what is being communicated to Muslims is that in the same way that there is continuous creation, in the same way that creation, this creator never stops creating. This creator is always a Alaq, is always engaged in this universe as a creator. Your charge as a human being, and eventually particularly as a Muslim, is to always learn. And the instrumentality for the dynamic of continuous learning is continuous reading. But you can learn fully accepting and in equilibrium with the idea that whatever you learn, you are learning through a partnership, through the care, through the auspices, through the direction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's not that I'm learning for the sake of learning. I am learning as an interactive dynamic with Allah. So I am learning with immoral purpose, immoral conscience, The moral conscience is always that this learning should strengthen my bonds with the divine, not unravel them. Or the other option is that you divorce the divine and you learn for the sake of learning. Now, of course, the Meccans, they were occupied with a third option, and that's no learning. There was no forward progression in the world of the Meccans. They were an illiterate society, a society not based on the pursuit of knowledge, but based on the pursuit of mythology and tradition. The Meccans, their past 500 years there was no change. They've been doing the same thing they've been doing decade after decade, century after century. It's the same beliefs, and ultimately their interaction with higher powers is always about what do I gain, what do I lose. And so there is no mobility within society. No one can begin as a nobody and through education and knowledge and achievement prove themselves. You are born into a status, you grow into the status, you will, those part of the priestly class will always be a part of the priestly class. The children of the priestly class will always be the priests of tomorrow. Even the person who occupies the role of the family that waters the pilgrims, the family that saqit hajij, the family that provides water to pilgrims, from decade to decade, century to century, it will always be the same family. It will always be the same processes of watering. Nothing changes, nothing grows, nothing evolves. That was the nature of this society. And this is precisely why when the first revelation comes, and it is Iqra, it is a revolution, because in one word, you've set the momentum to change an oral society into a written society. A society that had very little use for writing and for reading and for text and for libraries. There were no libraries. There were mu'allaqat, the poems that were hanging at the Kaaba. But there were no libraries. There hadn't been libraries in the history of Arabia, period. We actually have, there were libraries in Yemen, there were libraries in Egypt, there were libraries in Iraq, but Arabia itself had not evolved, had not changed for centuries. So you come and say, this Khaliq understand the majesty of this Khaliq. And in order to understand the majesty of this Khaliq, understand that the most spectacular thing about human beings is their ability to read and write. Because Iqra, this is the beginning of it, and then Allama bil qalam, taught by the pen. And this is not my observation, but even the medieval commentators noticed that they will often say, لولا القلم ما استقام دين ولا دنيا. And بسبب القلم خرج الناس من ظلمة الجهل إلى نور العلم. That if it hadn't been for the invention of the pen, meaning the invention of writing, in fact, neither deen nor dunya, neither religion nor the temporal affairs of this life would work. Nor would people have emerged from the darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge. But although commentator after commentator say this, and these are medieval commentators, right? But what gets often ignored is that this is a paradigm shift, because you are talking about commentators who now understand that orality is not enough, and that memory is not enough, and that tradition and storytelling is not enough. How did that shift happen? For them to just so casually say, well, the reason God mentions the pen to Muhammad is because if it hadn't been for the pen, religion wouldn't work, the world wouldn't work. If it hadn't been, because writing and reading is the most magical or the most miraculous of God's creation, and that God honored human beings with this skill in particular. So even, I mean, we don't want to, it's a interesting curiosity whether jinn have libraries. And most of the people who write about jinn say that jinn don't have libraries. That jinn tradition is an oral tradition. They have very different rules. But that reading and writing is a truly unique human thing. And it is reading and writing are the keys for human beings to do or to mimic or to keep up. The nature of God's relation with creation is dynamism. Creation is never static. There's constant movement. The instrumentality for human beings to also be dynamic is reading and writing. If they stop reading and writing, they become static. So, in order for human beings to be in harmony with the logic of creation, they need to do the very thing that allows them to learn. And if your knowledge through learning is growing, would it, Razi points this out quite intelligently, says, if the command is to read and write, would it make sense for a God who wants human beings to remain static to say read and write? Because if you read and write, then your knowledge is increasing. But if your knowledge is increasing, if the expectation is for your knowledge to increase but for you to remain static, that doesn't make any sense. Because if your knowledge will increase, so will your consciousness. So will your comprehension and understanding of things. Now, I would add to this, though. I mean, Razi doesn't mention moral consciousness, but I think that the dynamism is not just in how we live, and I'll show you in a second how this connects in an amazing way. It's not just in how you live or how you move or how you communicate or how you transport or how you, but the growth must be also in your moral consciousness. That our very sense and our very understanding of justice shifts and evolves as our knowledge increase. Our very understanding of equity shifts and evolves as our knowledge increase. Take, for example, a world. You live in a world at a certain moment in history in which at any given moment there are people being abducted and maybe murdered or sold into slavery or whatever, trafficked. You live in a historical moment in which there is no way for you to learn about the rate of abductions. There's no technological means of keeping track of how many people disappear, where they disappear, where they go. So you can imagine that you're living in a historical moment and all you know are rumors about what happens in your locality, or perhaps stories about travelers that are coming from Egypt and they say, well, this area, we heard stories that when people were going through this part of the desert, XYZ would happen to them. But knowledge evolves, and you go from a world in which we can't even say something like 20 people a day disappear in Europe to knowledge evolves where it's part of your consciousness. The rate of human suffering or the rate of aggression or the rate of assaults become a part of your consciousness. How could it be expected that you don't evolve? If you remain with the medieval frame of mind where you say, well, things happen in the world, it's all a mystery, and all I can do is affect my little space where I am, you haven't evolved. Moral consciousness itself is directly impacted by knowledge. And this is just a very, crass example, but our conceptions of what even something like compassion means grows with knowledge, with comprehension. So it is extremely significant that the first command is read. But human beings, be mindful. The challenge is not just to increase your knowledge and to grow with knowledge, but to do so accompanied by the divine. Why? Now, because as Surah Alaq will tell us, that human beings repeatedly manifest a pattern, and that is when their knowledge increase, when their ability to affect their environment and to control their environment increase, when their sense of sufficiency, self-sufficiency increase, the arrogance sets in and they imagine themselves to be, their sense of self-sufficiency to be divorced from their Lord, to not need God. But before we move to this, notice الذي علم بالقلم. The majority say al-qalam means the normal meaning, the pen. And here it's a reference to writing, that Allah is saying, reflect on the fact that God made you capable of reading and writing, and that this is truly miraculous, because no other creature on the face of this earth other than human beings have been given this ability. Some have said that a qalam here means the intellect, and that without an active intellect, and this is sort of this was especially among the Mu'tazili orientations, that without an active intellect, reading, قراءة تجميع الشيء, the word قرأ, it means to collect something. And the reason we call reading qira'ah is because you are putting the letters together. And putting the letters together in your mind into words, and then putting the words together in your mind into sentences, and putting the sentences together in your mind into concepts, into understandings. There are people who read, but in fact, they do not integrate. They do not collect what they're reading into integrated conceptual understandings. So they read without the intellect. So, for instance, the people who know how to read the Quran but they can't understand it, they just literally repeat the letters. But this is not the reading that God wants. God is telling you, read with your intellect. For the Mu'tazila and others, but especially it was Mu'tazila, who saying immoral reading demands that you read analytically. So the way they put it, if you read in a way that fails to notice the possible contradictions or inconsistencies, and does not work to resolve the contradictions and inconsistencies, then you are not reading with the use of the qalam, meaning the intellect. That it's active reading, it's engaged reading, it's a reading, and so if they in their conception, if you read, for instance, Allah loves qist, Allah loves justice, but you don't ask yourself, well, what is justice? Then you are reading without the intellect. Reading with the intellect requires that you are constantly seeking they would say the true meaning. I would say a deeper meaning. That you're always looking into. So whether it is, I tend to agree that al-qalam here doesn't just mean the pen, but at a deeper level means the intellect. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the very beginning, because Allah knows that Allah is creating a civilizational paradigm, and that eventually Allah will say, "Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat lin-nas," you are the best nation because you enjoin the good and resist the evil, that at the very beginning, Allah said, the cornerstone, the foundational stone, the emplacing for this dynamic is the dynamic of knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge and the growth through knowledge. The challenge, though, is not to become arrogant through the pursuit of knowledge, to imagine yourself as autonomous and independent in the universe. Okay. كلا إن الإنسان لا يطغى أن رآه استغنى. So that this is precisely, though, the problem, is that as human beings imagine, knowledge is always relative. وفوق كل علم عليم, that to every knowledge there is even the more knowledgeable, and to every knowing there is even a greater knowing, as Allah says in the Quran. But human beings demonstrate a pattern, is that whenever they believe that their knowledge has allowed them a level of autonomy or self-sufficiency, they imagine al-istighna. Istighna is, let's see what Muhammad Asad translated it. Self-sufficient, yeah. He just says self-sufficient. Istighna is to where you feel like you don't need anyone. You don't need God. Well, we can do this without God. Okay. God will tell us what the result of those who imagine themselves self-sufficient. Those who pursue knowledge, learn enough to start imagining themselves sort of another way of doing what the Meccans did. The Meccans excluded God because they believed that fate is controlled by the chance imposed by these demigods, these, various power sources of influence and powers, demons and angels and so on. Well, there's those who exclude God because of their perceived self-sufficiency end up doing the same thing. Both at the end up excluding God. Okay. So, notice, أرأيت الذي ينهى عبدا إذا صلى أرأيت إن كان على الهدى أو أمر بالتقوى أرأيت إن كذب وتولى ألم يعلم بأن الله يرى. So this salvo, hast thou ever considered him who tries to prevent a servant of God from praying? Has thou considered whether he is on the right way or is concerned with God consciousness? Has thou considered whether he may not be giving the lie to the truth and turning his back upon it? Does he then not know that God sees all? So here is where most of the tafsir tell you that what this is talking about is Abu Jahl. And that Abu Jahl would make it a point to harass the Prophet when he is praying at the Kaaba. And that Abu Jahl, in fact, once said that if I see him prostrating before the Kaaba, I'm going to put my boots on his head or on his neck. I'm going to step on him. And even the traditions go on to say that he tried to do so, but then he got scared because he saw a frightful specter, something terrified him, and he said, when I tried to approach him to step on him, a um, I saw a horrible, scary vision, and so on. Um, this report about seeing a scary vision is one of the narratives where I told you that you'll find a lot of fantastical mythology. Um, but the tendency to say that these ayat were talking about Abu Jahl and his harassment of the Prophet ﷺ, I think, again, it is one of these things where the limiting of the ayat to this historical context are unjustified. Yes, Abu Jahl was harassing the Prophet ﷺ, but he wasn't the only one. And in this narrative, in which we are told that when he attempted to physically harm the Prophet, that he was scared away by a specter, well, that doesn't make sense, because we know that the Prophet was physically harmed by others in other situations. So it's not that God made him immune from physical harm. And when you look into this tradition, again, you find these irksome issues of medieval transmission and medieval understanding and medieval ways of narrating values and meaning. I don't think that these ayat were where they yes, they might be commenting about Abu Jahl, they might be commenting on 10 other people other than Abu Jahl, or 100 people other than Abu Jahl. But if so, then we have to pay attention to what the message of these ayat are, not confine it to an individual and what happens with this individual. So, look, first, كلا إن الإنسان لا يطغى. Human beings, when they start thinking of themselves as self-sufficient, they become unjust. They become unjust towards others, they become unjust towards themselves. One of the most interesting points about أن رآه استغنى, and this is a long research story, but الاستغناء, I became very interested in what does أن رآه استغنى, what is what is the relationship between استغناء and طغيان? When you say كلا إن الإنسان لا يطغى, أن رآه استغنى, لا يطغى is become unjust, and أن رآه استغنى, that because of this perceived self-sufficiency. I found in particular sources their description of طغيان I thought was very interesting. They said that الإنسان إذا زاد ماله, if human beings, their money increases, their earnings increase, زاد طعامه وزادت ثيابه وزاد مركبه وشرابه وذلك طغيانه. That when human beings earn more, it is not just that their earnings increase, but their consumption increases. Their clothes become more expensive. Their means of transportation becomes more expensive. And that is the طغيان. That is the injustice that is partly being referred to here. If human beings, if their knowledge increases, and instead of this knowledge becoming about moral consciousness, about God consciousness, which is fundamentally about moral consciousness, their knowledge becomes, the increase of knowledge becomes a tool to increase their material wealth. And the increase of material wealth becomes an increase in consumption. This is precisely the طغيان, the injustice, the moral failure, because طغيان is just not injustice. طغيان is a oppressiveness, just injustice with oppressiveness and a fundamental moral failure. When you say طغى الإنسان, meaning they've become oppressive and morally bankrupt. طغيان is a very powerful word. So when human beings follow this formula of reading and learning, but instead of reading and learning becomes about moral growth, which is fundamentally your relationship with Allah, it becomes about material growth. And material growth becomes about consumptive growth, that your consumption increase. Then you've fallen in a طغيان. But the thing about طغيان is, when it's a cycle. First, you're increasing your knowledge. Then, because of the increase of knowledge, you increase your means. And because of increase of means, you increase your consumption. And because of the increase of your consumption, there is moral decay. But then, because of moral decay, what happens when there is moral decay? You don't want to hear those or see those who are advocating morality to you. And thus, أرأيت الذي ينهى عبدا إذا صلى أرأيت إن كان على الهدى أو أمر بالتقوى أرأيت إن كذب وتولى ألم يعلم بأن الله يرى. Because of that moral decay, this is exactly why you fall into, you find yourself forbidding or fighting, resisting. ينهى عبدا إذا صلى. You are resisting those who are come and prick your conscience, bother your conscience, because they are morally conscientious. Because they want the guidance. They want the loyalty to Allah. They want the relationship and the humility before the Creator. They want taqwa. Taqwa is moral consciousness. Taqwa is moral consciousness. أو أمر بالتقوى. So when they start advocating for moral consciousness, what do? You suppress them. You fight them. You say, shut up. You put them in prison. You ostracize them. You marginalize them. you want to quiet the voice that's bothering your conscience. Then Allah says, you see, in all of this, it's like you revert to the heathen Meccans, because the same way the heathen Meccans thought that Allah is disengaged, Allah doesn't see, Allah doesn't observe. Not Meccans thought that Allah doesn't see, Allah doesn't observe because Allah is disinterested, not because God is incapable, but because God doesn't want to see. There's no accountability after all. Well, you are going to be exactly like the heathen Meccans, because ultimately your arrogance will allow you to come in and say God doesn't see anything, because not because God is disinterested, but because there is no God. Same result. You're going to exclude God. And when you exclude God, this is what the look. كلا لئن لم ينتهي لنسفعا بالناصية ناصية كاذبة خاطئة فليدع نادية سندع الزبانية. So, no, indeed, the result of this is لنسفعا بالناصية. Let's see how Muhammad Asad translates it. That's 15. Nay, if he desist not, we shall most sorely drag him down upon his forehead. Okay, very literal, but yeah. Nasfa'an Nasfa'an bin Nasiya is a idiomatic expression. An-Nasiya comes from the hairlock at the front of a horse, and it was used to refer to the forehead. Saf' al-Nasiya is when a person is degraded because it's as if their head has been lowered to humiliation and degradation, to loss, to utter loss. So Allah comes and tells you that there's fate of such a human being. At the end, such a human being thinks that their nadia, their system of support, will avail them. In fact, it will avail them nothing. Their system of support is nothing more than a distraction and like basically distracting entertainment. Their system of support that tells them, oh, don't worry about God, there is no God. Oh, this person who's telling you be moral, do good, they're just loser. They're just losers in life. And all of these people, in the same way, the truth of the matter of your nadia, of your system of support, is that you and them are waiting for the zabaniya. You are waiting for the tools of the extensions of God's power, those who are going to inflict punishment. But there is another meaning also. Sanad'u Zabaniya. Let's see how Muhammad Asad translates Zabaniya. See if he got that or not. Okay. Well, shall summon the forces of heavenly chastisement. He said, Muhammad Asad says, we shall summon the forces of heavenly chastisement. Yes, that's one of the meanings. But as Zabaniya, are those forces that can inflict great suffering and great harm. Not necessarily as just punishment. So, for instance, if you are a political prisoner and you're being tortured, you refer to your torturers, the people who torture you, as zabaniyat al-sijn. So, the zabaniya are any forces that cause severe suffering. Now, there is the suffering in the hereafter, but also the effect of this nausea that becomes degraded, the effect of human beings taking a course of action that results in their own degradation because they've abandoned the moral path. They've abandoned moral consciousness. And not only that, it's not just that they abandoned it, but they've even become unjust by persecuting those who call for moral consciousness, for the clean path. Their fate is, Allah says, Nasfa'an bin Nasiyah, that Allah will allow them to crumble into humiliation and degradation. But also, they will call great suffering upon themselves. I believe that Allah is saying, in the same way that Allah does, I will allow your demons to haunt you. I will allow your evil deeds to befall you. So, when you watch something like human beings commit a great deal of injustice, and as a result, this injustice results in severe suffering, like starvation, like economic collapse, like civil war, like foreign invasion. Isn't this nad'u zabaniyah? You are suffering the consequences of sustained arrogance and sustained injustice. You've created it. You've done it to yourself. And Allah warned you and allowed you, ultimately, Allah saves you from the consequences of your evil deeds many times, but eventually, as Allah has warned, tells us elsewhere that Allah is constantly saving people from the follies of their deeds. But when this dynamic works out and Allah finally says, okay, fine, you've insisted, suffer the consequences. And that is why then Allah's succinct advice to Muhammad, and here is, of course, it's not to Muhammad, it's to all of us. Understand this process, understand this dynamic. But what should you do? كلا لا تطعه واسجد واقترب. Then don't fall in the trap of this dynamic and this process. You read and pursue knowledge, but do so in the name of your Lord. And never persecute those who amara bit-taqwa. And never think that you are entitled to istighna. And never fall into tughyan. Never fall into the trap of, I have more, so I spend more. I'm entitled to greater luxury. No, you're not. That's not the formula. That's not the dynamic. What you should do, don't obey, meaning don't succumb, don't surrender to this dynamic. Wasjud waqtarib, and seek iqtirab. Now, there's a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that says that a human being is the closest to their Lord in his prostrated state. When they're in sujood, they're the closest to their Lord. And the best dua is the dua you do in sujood. So, but that's sort of a technical way of looking at it, or a mechanical way of looking at things. The point is, the moral thrust is that your attitude is to constantly seek after your Lord through sujood, meaning dhikr, and iqtirab, to seek after a closer and closer relation. Make your growth of knowledge, make the dynamic of increased knowledge bring you closer to your Lord, not further away from your Lord. And because this is the first revelation, Allah communicates this message in a singular form. Because when Muslims saw the singular form, they said, oh, well, it's singular, it must be referring to Abu Jahl. It's singular because it's talking to Muhammad, who at this point has no followers. And it is warning about something that Muhammad himself, it will take centuries of human epistemological growth to fully understand the import of Surah Al-Alaq. But, and this is a very big but, the early Muslims, the first generations of Muslims, must have intuitively got the message. Because they go from an oral society to a literate society. They go from a society that doesn't have libraries and doesn't value text to a society that is obsessed with libraries and obsessed with texts. So obsessed that although the Mongols threw so many texts that they turned the color of the Euphrates black from all the ink, millions of texts still survived. I mean, we have no idea the texts that were lost. And although the literary tradition of the Mu'tazila, for instance, have been largely lost, but still what has survived is enormous. And the simple fact, look at these like archaeological points that are, the fact that Muslims learned from, look at pre-Islamic poetry. Pre-Islamic poetry never starts in the name of God or in the name of, it's very secular. It's all about my pride, the pride of my tribe, my wealth, the wealth of my desire, my lust, the desire of those I care about. It's all about very secular. It's all about power. It's all about to being obsessed with never starting a text without first full communication of submission to God. How does this anthropological change occur? How do you go from a people that like to talk about material things to a people who, before they get into anything, any topic, even when they write about science or mathematics, they have to first always go through, in the name of the Lord, who is great, who has inspired us, to a long dibaja, a long introduction about how grateful they are to God and so on. This tells you that the change created by the Quran was profound and massive. And Surah Al-Alaq is at the heart of that change. One last note. I've said this before, but no harm in saying it again. You know, I've said this before, but I've always been struck by when the narrations that the Prophet, when he receives Surah Al-Alaq, and he is understandably, very shaken, and he goes home and talks to Khadija, his wife, and she encourages him and so on. And when he tells her, I fear that I'm losing my mind, and she answers, and I'm always struck by her reasoning as to why God would never fail him. She says, إنك لا تصل الرحم وتحمل الكل وتكسب المعدوم وتقري الضيف وتعين على نوائب الحق. That you are تصل الرحم, you honor your relatives. تحمل الكل, that you carry sustenance to those who need it. وتكسب المعدوم, and you always help the indigent. وتقري الضيف, and you are always generous and kind to guests. وتعين على نوائب الحق, or تعين على نوائب الظهر, depending on the version, and you always help and aid people when they are in need. Her whole reasoning as to why God can never fail Muhammad are all downright ethical precepts, intuitively understood and comprehended in ethical values. That is a profound indication that when that so much of virtue and ethics are intuitively known, confirmed by God. God didn't come to construct a legalistically based system of ethics. It is law was supposed to affirm intuitively known and comprehended system of ethics. Okay, that is it. Alhamdulillah. That completes Surah Al-Alaq, Project Ulum style.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I completely agree 100% with Witzke's comment. That was absolutely epic. So thank you so much. What was very interesting is the first time we did Surah Al-Alaq was January 18th of 1997. So it's been over 25 years, which is incredible. And so it's really like I can still remember we were doing this in Texas very shortly after we got married. And so this is like, and so the journey begins. It's amazing.
There was one other time.
There was what? One other time?
One other time when you started it, but you only, I think, like did a couple of verses.
Oh, when you started it and only
When
did
I
a
was at
couple of
UCLA.
verses? Oh, really?
You were gonna start at tafsir.
Oh, but Alaq.
He started with Al-Alaq.
Oh, do you
But you
remember?
like-
Did you start
I
with
don't
Alaq?
remember.
Oh my gosh, so many things. It's pretty incredible.
I don't know.
I wanted to thank Omar for adopting this surah, and also take this as an opportunity to plug that we still have 21 surahs that have yet to be adopted. So if you want to be on this, on the legacy forever, join us, adopt a surah, and inshallah, it would be our honor to include your name in the tafsir. And so when, hundreds of years from now, people find this tafsir, inshallah, they'll be like, who is that? But you'll be part of it, and it'll continue to earn hasanat long after we all leave this planet, inshallah. So check it out. If you go to the usuli.org website, there's a Project Illumine page, Adopt a Surah. You can see what is still remaining. With one caveat, we just had a recent adoption of Surah Al-Zukhruf, and I haven't had a chance to update the website. So everything else, though, is, I think, current. And And alhamdulillah, I just, wanted to say that as, as a convert, like I've said this before, but you really don't realize how much you miss by, reading English translations. This project has so clearly every time underscored just the paucity of meaning, just how like limited you are in your understanding of this incredible book just by having one meaning, one verse, one iteration when you look at any translation. And I think even tonight's halakha just makes it so clear. I mean, every single surah that we've covered has really demonstrated the nuance and the different ways you can understand the verses. But this one in particular, when you go in and you tell us about your research of Arabic poetry, for example, to understand this issue of like pressing on, the Prophet, peace be upon him. I mean, who really, this is such a gift, like when you can take us through this research journey with you, when you can say, I was really like curious about this idea of pressing on him and making this whole experience more traumatic. And then to find that this meaning was about an overwhelming moment, that you found this, in love poetry, and that, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, felt overcome. This just touches you in such a deep and meaningful way. It changes your feeling about everything that you're reading. And these are the types of things that make the Quran penetrate your brain, penetrate your heart, and make the whole tradition come alive. Understanding what a revolution it was and a paradigm shift to go from an oral tradition to a written tradition, and everything with knowledge. And we know from our own experience how when you increase in knowledge, you increase in arrogance, in, your ability to feel self-sufficient. I mean, this is all stuff that as you hear it, you recognize it to be true. It's intuitive. You know people, you've seen it, you see it in yourself. This is what makes the Quran, again, become, a living tradition, something that is meaningful and life transformative. And I think for people who just believe that the Quran is medieval and has nothing to say to us, this completely flies in the face of that. And so just, it's so, I don't even remember 25 years ago you talking about this or what you said. I know it was a very different thing, but to have the opportunity to go through it again is just truly such a divine gift. Thank you, alhamdulillah, for you sharing this epic understanding with us. Before, I know you wanted to add more, but I wanted to ask you, before we get into the questions, go ahead. I don't know, you had something else you wanted to add, right?
Yeah, okay, but before I do, just the comments you made sort of struck me. Just remember just this about the adoption of the surah, sadaqah jariyah. I mean, subhanallah, every
What does that mean for a non-Arabic speaker?
I mean, an ongoing source of hasanat. That's literally what sadaqah jariyah is. It's that you perform a sadaqah and it keeps giving
Charity.
more.
Sadaqah is charity, right?
But subhanallah, that even like any good you do is described as a sadaqah, and it keeps earning hasanat. So every time someone learns something from this tafsir or is touched by it or it affects them, and you earn hasanat for long after you're even around. The the other thing I was going to say, just because of your comments, it, the fact that you were touched by the touched by this point about pressing on him and so on, it maybe it teaches me to actually always err on the side of inclusion, because I came very close to not even mentioning this point. I thought it's, who would be interested in it. So
Don't
it's
rush,
interesting.
don't omit. Don't pass
Yeah.
over.
I just thought it's
You gotta
such
add to
a
our
yeah,
chant.
it's such a yeah. Anyway, it's such a bookish point, but also it's not just the paucity of translations. Because even if well, one, a lot of people who know Arabic, they think they can understand pre-modern texts, but actually they don't. So, I mean, the problem with a lot of the tafsir literature is that people open up books that were written centuries ago and they think they understand what they're reading, but they don't. But but even if they do, um, the I mean, since the age of civilization ended, and then we entered into the age of colonialism, and commentaries on the Quran have ceased to try bringing the Quran to life, and often actually a lot of the modern commentaries they copy, literally just copy verbatim from the tradition, sometimes even without bothering even elaborating or explaining or adding anything. Um, so, I mean, subhanallah, knowing knowing what the tafsir literature is like and knowing what is out there, uh, yeah, you'd wish that there was greater receptivity to what we're doing, because I know that, and subhanallah, I mean, this is up to Allah, but it's just, yeah, the tradition is. Oh, but anyway, yeah, what I want to say is 2 points. One, notice that in Surah Al-Alaq, I mean, I've already alluded to it when I said that this is a different understanding of God, because here, when Surah Al-Alaq says, don't they know that God sees, they will return to God, this is a vested God, this is an involved God. But the other point is that a something that's going to become a consistent theme in the Quran, and that is the system of morality doesn't work. And this is a consistent point in the Quran. System of morality, moral consciousness does not really work without a higher power that is observing, that is keeping account, and that ultimately delivers justice. And so when even it talks about those who will oppress, those who seek taqwa, in other words, those who will enter the role of the oppressors, and the comment to ultimately what that means is that they enter the role of the oppressors is they act upon their power, and it's telling them that yes, you're acting upon your power, but there are consequences. And I think that is we take this for granted all the time, but this is a critical point of morality, because it is very easy to conceive of moral awareness losing its footing, or becoming self indulgent, or becoming self referential, or becoming distorted in a million different ways if it is not anchored in the belief, in the conviction that justice is possible and justice is certain at the end. The corruptions of power has a distorting lens, and it's a consistent distorting lens unless you're able to say, well, I might distort perceptions of things, but God's perception is not distortable, and the consequences per God's perception, I can't affect that, and I can't manipulate that. So we notice in Surah Al-Alaq, when it says, "Alam ya'lam anna Allah yara kalla ila rabbika ruj'a," that you will return to God, but don't you know that God sees? This consistent theme that we see, for instance, in which we talked about Surah Abbas, for instance, that this the moral presence of God for moral accountability and moral cohesion is really important. The other point is, note at the let's see how he translates it. It says ناصية كاذبة خاطئة. This is 16. Okay, so Muhammad Asad translates it very literally. Say, the lying, rebellious forehead. Okay, so لنسفعا بالناصية, that it's, as I said, it's idiomatic that for humiliation and degradation and loss. In a horse, this area, that what is called the nasiya at the front, is often an indication of the value of a horse. So in Arabic poetry, they talk a great deal about, there's so many descriptions of a horse's nasiya, because the value of the horse and the beauty of a horse was often focused on, they saw with their eye what a person who doesn't know anything about horses like myself doesn't quite understand. But anyway, in human beings, the nasiya is the center of what was understood or was often portrayed as the center of your identity, the center of who you are. And when Allah describes us as nasiya, kaziba, khati'ah, so these two things, khati'ah, it is mistaken. It is in a state of grievous error. So it's saying nasiya khati'ah is like, you think you are, with your knowledge, your increased knowledge, with your self-sufficiency, with your autonomy, so you think you are something, but in reality, you don't know, you don't realize how deeply in error you've sunk. The other is the kaziba. It's a lying nasiya. Why lying? Because it lies to itself, and ultimately, in order to justify fighting moral consciousness and morally conscientious people, it will have to resort to deception and lies. That you are not going to be able to persecute people who are seeking the moral path without lying corruptions about who you are, about what they are, about the reality that you live in. you're not just going to corrupt this reality for yourself, but you're going to corrupt it for other people to justify. Like, and later on, the Quran often portrays the Pharaoh as an example of that, who consistently is forced to tell people, don't trust your moral understandings, trust your, and in fact, the Pharaoh does what tyrants always have to do, to portray those on the ethical path as corruptors of the earth. To say, oh, they're there for Isat fil Ard, which is a horrendous lie, because you are causing corruption, and you take those who are on an ethical path and you portray them as the corruptors, which anyone that has studied tyranny and tyrants in history will see this as a steady theme. That's the first thing tyrants say. So this type of oppression doesn't become possible without literally a lying nausea. The essence the essence of that being, of the oppressor, becomes about lies to themselves, lies to others. Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing, because we look at what happens in our world today, and it's just as relevant, if not more so, now, 1,400 years later. So again, it's another validation of how powerful this message is at every level. Okay, I wanted to start by my favorite question is if you could tell us about your engagement with Surah Alaq, if you recall, like, where you were. This is like probably a really long time ago.
Well, it wasn't 97, because back in 97, I was in a very different relationship with the Quran. I was much more focused on largely communicating the tradition. And yeah, there were interventions, but the interventions were often on micro points. Surah Al-Alaq, when I decided to, and initially, remember that I was just doing this for myself, because I never thought that I'm going to share it with anyone. But I thought, okay, well, I want to understand things not being so slavishly bound to tradition. It was the surah that I took on after the Fatiha. And I had reached the conclusion that the Fatiha is like a covenant. It's a contractual covenant between God and human beings. It is literally the key to everything. And if my journey with Al-Alaq was that I felt like, it would always, I grew up hearing people always say, oh, this is God's first command was to read, and this is, but yeah, but it's not just to read, but what is reading about, and what is growth of knowledge about. And the most liberating thing with Surah Al-Alaq is when I've realized that the connections between Surah Al-Alaq and limiting it to what Abu Jahl did, that connection was tenuous. Because I always was under the impression that this was an absolutely 100%. There's it's decided, it's settled. You're not going to be able to raise any questions about that. Alaq was revealed about Abu Jahl. But when I started looking into the origins of that and the ahadith, the transmissions, and I found actually there it's far more. Yeah, sure that narration is in Bukhari, but in Bukhari and many other books of hadith, but the narration tells you about Abu Jahl and his persecution of the Prophet, saying that Surah Al-Alaq was about this particular narration that we find in Bukhari and Muslim and so on, is the part that's tenuous. It was sort of a thing of some commentators or very early commentators say, well, this matches this, rather than we having a um, a resolute source that tells us no, God absolutely revealed this surah about Abu Jahl. And then you start understanding, then you start pursuing the language of what does nasiya mean, what does nasfa'an bin nasiya. So what could the meaning beyond a historical event be? And I think, put it this way, Surah Al-Alaq, because it's the first revelation, also set a roadmap for the rest of the Quran. It's you can't understand the Quran. Or put it this way, you must understand the Quran in light of what Surah Al-Alaq says, because everything that it tells us about knowledge, about learning, about growth, about moral consciousness is it's an elaboration and a development upon the theme that was established by Surah Al-Alaq. And it is when you understand that, God, from the very first revelation, told you individually, because again, I was initially thinking I'm never going to share this, the pursuit of knowledge could be about moral growth and should be about moral growth. It changes your relationship to reading. Reading is not just about getting a degree or getting tenure or entertainment, or reading becomes a moral act about moral growth. Surah Al-Alaq anchored my understanding that the reason Allah says read and reminds us of the miracle of writing and reading and the role of the intellect is that your relationship to knowledge must be a relationship of moral growth. So if you are reading, and this is, I mean, at the time, I've always been, as you know, fascinated by horror movies and subjects like Satanists and things like that. Well, if you use reading to achieve the opposite of moral growth, I understood why it is such a massive sin. So those who actually use that remarkable gift but fail to achieve moral growth, it really clicked why they are described as having such a decrepit nausea. But it was early in the process, so I remember we were in Van Nuys, like a year before we moved to Thousand Oaks. So what is that?
About
maybe
2014. Was it
yeah.
after the heart attack or before?
It was after the heart attack.
So after 2013. So was it one of the
The,
first
the heart attack
surahs?
was, by the way, one of the reasons I started on this journey, was the Quran. So
Well, so was it one of the first ones you engaged?
yeah, it was right after Fatiha.
So Fatah, you started with Fatah.
Yeah, I started with Fatiha.
Wow, amazing. So actually, the one thing I forgot to say in the introduction is you had said that now, as we approach the shorter surahs through Project Illumine, that you were going to try and stay as close to Order of Revelation
Yeah,
as possible.
I'm gonna
So,
try to stay. Yeah.
inshallah. Okay, wonderful. And this is supposed to also be a Q&A for Mumtahana, so I don't want to lose the opportunity to ask you about your engagement with Surah Mumtahana and where you were and what was going on with that too.
Montana was late. In the little book of where I tried to reconstruct the. Yeah, I mean, it looked like I focused on Mumtahina around the same time, or right after Nisa, which is, I'm not quite sure why, but. Um, I was in Thousand Oaks about a year after we moved there. Yeah, Mumtahina is, um, from the tafsir, Mumtahina, you get the impression, or you learn from the tafsir that Mumtahina was about um, um, about calling out the hypocrites um, who had failed to join the pilgrimage, and telling them that they don't have a share. They're not going to be able to share in the booty of war, the spoils of war, and that Mumtahina was about telling Muslim women that they can't be married to non-Muslims. So you're always given a very legalistic um, understanding of Mumtahina. That this is the surah in which it was legislated that Muslim women cannot be married to a non-Muslim, and so the focus of the in at least the tafsir type learning is that women who would convert after Sulh al-Hudaybiyah, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, that they were not returned back to Quraysh because their marriages are dissolved, because their marriages are void from once they became Muslim, they can't remain married to non-Muslims. But there were a lot of questions that um, it was never convincing to me that the whole issue was the quote unquote the hypocrites, is that they're just told you can't take you can't share in the spoils of war. I mean, it just didn't it didn't jive with the Quranic message. Um, um, it Mumtahina has a number of predictions, which I remember, like I wrote, are these predictions? Why the predictions? Because it talks about the future and it says about things that had not unfolded at the time al-Mumtahana is revealed. And understanding al-Mumtahana, and it had a very different tone and style than al-Ahzab, for instance, or um, earlier surah about even the Battle of Badr or Uhud, or where even if there's a victory, Muslims are chided rather than given good news. Um, and there was a part to Mumtahina that just confounded me, and that is this whole insistence upon treating the dissolved marriages as a khula. You return the dowry rather than just saying the marriage is dissolved, which is just knowing, reading medieval legal history, you know that that's what normally, no one would ever think of compensating the enemy for anything, or, you know, so these types of questions is what, although Mumtahna is quite short, but it took a lot of work because trying to figure out answers to these questions turned out to be a much more involved research than I initially had thought. Um, and I wasn't using a computer where I can put in search words and stuff like that. So I'm using tables of content, and I'm reading hundreds of pages in hope of finding a reference in sources that are I remember, for instance, I was reading for hundreds of pages in Ansab al Arab, um, uh, Ansab al Ashraf, which is, an unusual source. It's not the type of source that you would think but I remember I was looking for a particular issue about, anyway. Um, so it was a lot of work, but then once I put the research together after taking all the notes on specific issues, then Mumtahana sort of came to light in a very powerful and unmistakable way. That it it was a turning of a new chapter, and and a new phase in the seventh Hijri year, and importantly, it started setting the stage to the Prophet ﷺ leaving the scene. We'll talk about this, inshallah, when we deal with Tawbah and Al-Ma'idah. Um, but it's clear that after the seventh Hijri year, Allah was setting the grounds for the Prophet leaving the scene. And inshallah, we'll talk about that. And that had, when you realize that, it has a profound impact. It's from, and it's actually, it has a profound emotional impact because you realize that, you know, 12 years of setting the foundation in Mecca, and then 7 years of um, unrelenting moral lessons in Medina. And then 3 years of saying, okay, people, you're going to be on your own. Um, don't mess it up. It of course affects your relation to the Quran. It's then you can't read any part of the Quran uh, separate from the rest of the Quran. It's like every part of the Quran you read has to relate to all other parts of the Quran. And the zikr for Mumtahina is verse 5.
And how about for Alaq? Is it the
There's
whole
no
thing?
zikr, it's the
Okay.
whole thing.
You know, I think one of the things that's so powerful, I love asking you to tell us about your engagement and want to encourage you not to leave out anything small either, is because it also teaches us lessons about how to interact and how to think of the Quran. Like even just what you said about how when you read the Quran, you can't read anything separate from anything else, that you have to take it as its totality, or when you're thinking about Surah Alaq, that this is setting the stage for, you know, the rest of the revelation to come, and that, you know, you always have to be thinking back to that, like, is your reading increasing your moral growth and all of that. Like, these are the lessons that we don't hear anywhere else. Even if you just read the Quran, you wouldn't ever get that. So that is really, truly gold for us. So thank you for sharing that. I want to open it up to any questions here, and we can cover both Alaq and Mumtahana. I know, Rami, you had one, right? No. Joe?
It's a good
Cheyenne?
thing. No questions are a good thing.
This is your
Stop,
chance.
Stop instigating.
Okay. Anybody? Harvey?
Very technical question.
Okay, we'll take it.
Thank you so much, Ed. Do you remember the note? I'm thinking of future tafsir publication. I echo Grace, the note about the love poetry, and that's absolutely something to include.
Oh,
So I'm glad you included it. Do you remember, have you got written down anywhere the sources? Because I think that's something that would be a real flash, that would really jump off the page.
I'll have to look. I mean, you know, for the irony is a shift from an oral tradition to a written, but when I was doing this, I don't know, I was just completely convinced I'm not going to share it with anyone. It's just for me. So I often wasn't. So I'd have to look. I hope I wrote it. 'Cause I don't. Yeah, I don't know. But I think I can probably, if I'm looking for it, I can probably retrace where I can find the evidence of أخذني فغطاني, because I sort of have an image of myself reading in Alaq al-Farid, but which volume? I mean, yeah, I'd have to look.
Okay. I have a couple questions from Audit. Thank you, Audit. Let me start with the shorter one, which is the adopted surah is considered a sadaqah jariyah. Is that also valid for discharging Ramadan zakat as well? I somehow thought the Ramadan zakat is a standalone obligation and couldn't be treated as sort of a two birds and one stone concept.
No, okay, let's just distinguish, because there is the Zakat fitr, which is a set amount, but it's a small amount. It's Zakat al-Fitr in American dollars. Do you guys remember what is it?
Like $10 to $20.
Yeah, it's something like $10 to $20. But probably the zakat that added means is the annual zakat that
Yes, he says yes.
Yeah. Uh, no, that zakah can, that annual zakah can go to to any charitable or Islamic, um, because masarif al zakah, or the things that you can spend zakah on, is set in the Quran. And so, helping the orphan, helping the wayfarer, and among them is, um, supporting the cause of God. And a definitely zakah can be a sadaqah jariyah, because the all zakah is also a sadaqah. And all sadaqah jariyah means is that you are spending on something that just doesn't get consumed one time, or helps and gets consumed one time. So, for instance, people who expended their zakat in building a school, that school is a sadaqah jariyah, because the hasanat from that school keep paying out, every time people are educated. Or if you uh, use your zakat to build a hospital, you continue earning hasanat every time people benefit from the hospital. Or a old Islamic practice, because in the pre-modern time, the desert environment, long distances, people would use their zakat to build a sabil. A sabil is basically a water source where people can obtain water for free. And they would build it in a spot where people are traveling, their people, communicating back and forth. And although it was built with zakat money, but the hasanat that comes from that, it pays off hasanat every time someone uses it. And depending on how long it's there, it could be paying off hasanat for decades. Um, like digging wells, for instance, which was one of the, looking for groundwater and then digging a well so that travelers would be able to access water. Um, so Sadaqah Jariyah is a description of the sort of the moral quality of the act, not the legal category of the act.
Alhamdulillah. That's beautiful. Thank you. Okay, so this is really cool. Actually, Audit shared I guess, an interpretation of the first 5 verses, right? So the question is, may I ask if the following 5 verses in English translation are valid, or if they have any legitimate Islamic root in Islamic traditions, because it's worded in a very different translation, yet in my opinion a very relevant translation in modern day context for humans, civic progress, etc. So this is a very different translation of the first 5 verses. Verse 1, blossom forth, and I should say this is taken from Muhammad the World Changer by Muhammad Jabara. Blossom forth, inspired by your rejuvenating cosmic mentor, who revives the dormant to forge empowering connections. Dare to blossom as your cosmic mentor provides spiritual comfort, the visionary one who guides the unlocking of layers of learning, elevates the stagnant to once inconceivable heights.
I'm gonna say, I mean, it's very poetical, um, but um, but unrelated to the language. So, blossom forth, inspired by your rejuvenating cosmic mentor. Iqra bismi rabbika. Okay, so how is Iqra blossom forth? Bismi rabbika, in the name of your Lord, inspired by your rejuvenating cosmic mentor. So God has to be a cosmic mentor, and um, then who revives the dormant to forge empowering correct connections. اسم ربك الذي خلق الإنسان من علق, who created humans from a clot. That's the literal language. This becomes who revives the dormant to forge empowering connections. So, if you're looking for the where's the Arabic in empowering connections? Is alaq the dormant? So I guess but not every dormant, everything is alaq. So I mean, it's very poetical, but it, this is like poetry writing a new Quran. Um, you're inspired by, but it's writing a different text.
It shouldn't be called a translation. Was it intended to be a translation? No. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I have a problem with calling God a cosmic mentor. Um, and I have a problem with thinking of khalq, of creation, as forged, empowering connections. It's very new agey. It appeals to new agey people, but it creates immense philosophical problems. Um, Dare to blossom, again, very self-helpy, new agey. Dare to blossom, as your cosmic mentor provides spiritual comfort. I have a very big problem with describing God as just providing spiritual comfort. It caters to the new agey, selfish, right entitled human being who wants the entire cosmos to be about them and about catering to them. It's the same thing, like, my guiding angels and my parents are the dead taking care of me, and uh, my spiritual guides who, it's just. But philosophically, I mean, God becomes a cosmic mentor providing spiritual comfort. That's God's role. Uh, so how about, and to blossom force inspired by rejuvenating. So blossom force, does it matter what moral path I'm blossoming forth? What if I'm blossoming forth to be like that imam in Dubai, the Badr project? What is it called? That guy?
Oh,
Better Club?
the Butter
Yeah,
Club.
the Badr Club.
Okay, we'll have to
Right,
show people
right.
that.
I mean, this is exactly the type of Islam, the Badr Club, that would inspire the Badr Club Emirati type Islam, where Badr becomes about
Testosterone.
making testosterone, male testosterone, making a lot of money, marrying more than one woman, you know, uh, because that's actually part of their advertise, how to marry one woman and work on the second as you're married to the first.
What we're talking about, for people who don't know, if you go to YouTube and search up Butter Club, Badr Club, is that right? Butter Club. This is this Emirati-inspired
It's a-
commercial, high quality, high definition. It's all about, like, learning how to be a man and how you have to be learn to drive fast cars and ride fast horses, and they'll take your $3,000 a week and turn you into part of the materialistic Butter Club. It's kind of a, yeah, mashallah, shocking kind of video, but very Emirati at this point. Check it out.
I mean, I can tell that the person who wrote this has read a lot of new agey self-help stuff. Muhammad Jabara. I don't know who he is, but he's read a lot of new agey self-help stuff.
We'll check it out. Thank you, Audit. That was a really good question. And it was great to see your reaction, too. So that was very valuable. Thank you so much. Okay, that is all the questions we have. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Get excited, Surah Al-Tawbah next week, inshallah. That'll be a
Just
big one.
pray
It'll
that
be
Allah
several
helps me,
sessions.
because I'm just have work popping up from every crook and can. What is that expression?
Nook and cranny.
Nook and cranny.
Usually I say we're buried under 2 mountains. I think we should increase, and it's like 3 or 4 mountains now. So it's crazy.
And as always,
pray for us.
is rich people's fault. Just remember that.
Making friends. Okay, everybody have a wonderful week. Inshallah, we will see you very soon.
Okay.
Assalamu
Assalamu alaikum.
alaikum.